The hum of machinery filled the cavernous space of Crestview Heights manufacturing plant, a sound that had become as familiar to Jeremiah J. Thompson as his own heartbeat. The rhythmic clanking of metal against metal was oddly soothing, a melody of purpose that kept the city's working class alive. For the past 8 years, Jay had spent more hours here than at home, feeding presses and hauling parts while dreaming of a better life for his wife and kids. But today was different. The announcement came through the crackling intercom, delivered by a voice too smooth, too detached. Jay froze mid-motion, the steel component in his hands suddenly feeling heavier. Effective immediately, Crestview Heights manufacturing plant will cease operations. All employees are required to attend a mandatory meeting in the break room. The press groaned to a halt, and the hum that had always blanketed the factory faded into a suffocating silence. Around him, the men and women who had become his second family over the years stood still, their faces blank with disbelief. "What the hell?" murmured Carl, a wiry man with grease-stained overalls who worked beside Jay on the line. Jay didn't respond. He couldn't. His legs moved on autopilot, following the procession of workers to the break room, where management stood waiting, their crisp suits a jarring contrast to the grime-streaked crowd before them. The meeting was short, clinical, and void of empathy. The plant, they explained, was no longer profitable. Corporate had decided to outsource operations overseas. Severance packages would be distributed by mail. Jay stared at the man speaking, his words blurring into white noise. Profitable? How many nights had he and his coworkers pulled double shifts to meet quotas? How many birthdays and anniversaries had they missed to keep this place running? The room erupted into chaos. Shouts, curses, sobs. "This is bullshit," Carl shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. "You can't just throw us out like this." The manager shifted uncomfortably, but his face remained impassive. "I understand this is difficult." "No, you don't understand," another voice yelled from the back. Jay felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Big Mike, a veteran worker nearing retirement. "You good, Jay?" Jay nodded mechanically, though his chest felt tight. Good? He wasn't sure what that even meant anymore. The drive home was a blur. Jay's old Chevy rattled as it rolled down streets lined with boarded-up shops and crumbling facades, the ghosts of a once thriving community. Crestview Heights had been in decline for years, but the factory was one of the last lifelines. Without it, what hope did the neighborhood have? At home, Latrice was sitting at the kitchen table, a stack of bills spread before her. The sight made Jay's stomach churn. She looked up as he entered, her face lighting up briefly before clouding with worry. "You're home early," she said, standing to greet him. Jay kissed her cheek, lingering for a moment to gather his thoughts. He couldn't find the words to say it, so he handed her the letter the managers had distributed on their way out. Latrice's brow furrowed as she read. When she looked up, her eyes were wide with panic. "What does this mean? They're closing?" Jay nodded, sinking into the chair across from her. "But, Jay, what are we going to do? The mortgage? I know. The kids' school fees? I know. Latrice?" The words came out sharper than he intended, and he immediately regretted it. "I'm sorry. I'll figure something out." Latrice sat back down, rubbing her temples. "We've been cutting back for months already. There's nothing left to cut. And jobs? Jay, where are you going to find another job around here?" Her voice cracked on the last word, and Jay reached for her hand. "I don't know yet, but I'll figure it out. I promise." She nodded, but her silence spoke louder than words. Later that night, Jay stood in the backyard, staring at the rusted swing set he'd built for his kids when they were toddlers. He could hear their laughter from inside the house, oblivious to the storm brewing in their parents' lives. He lit a black and mild, the first in months, and inhaled deeply. The burn in his chest was almost comforting. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he glanced at the screen. It was Slim. Jay hesitated before answering. Yo. Jay, what's good? Slim's voice was smooth, almost too friendly. I heard about the plant, man. That's tough. You holding up? Jay didn't respond. Slim didn't call just to check on him. Listen, Slim continued, his tone casual. You know I got ways to help you out if you're interested. Nothing crazy, just some easy money to get you back on your feet. Jay's jaw tightened. He knew what Slim meant. They'd grown up together, but their lives had taken drastically different paths. Slim ran the streets now, and while Jay had always stayed away, he couldn't deny the temptation creeping in. I'm good, Jay said finally, though the words felt hollow. All right, Slim replied, his voice laced with skepticism. But if you change your mind, you know where to find me. As the call ended, Jay stared at the darkened street beyond his fence. His resolve was already beginning to crack. The smell of disinfectant hung in the air as Latrice Thompson knelt on the floor of the daycare, scrubbing crayon marks off the wall. Her back ached, and her hands were raw from the endless cleaning, but there wasn't time to stop. She glanced at the clock. Only 30 more minutes until closing. A chorus of children's laughter echoed through the small room, a symphony of innocence that somehow lightened the weight on her shoulders. She turned to see Jada, a bright-eyed 5-year-old, braiding her classmate's hair with clumsy fingers. Jada, baby, we don't braid other people's hair without asking, Latrice said gently, pushing herself up with a groan. Jada pouted, crossing her arms. But it's pretty. It is, Latrice agreed, smiling despite herself. But let's ask first, okay? Come on, time to clean up. As she helped the children gather toys and crayons, her mind wandered back to the letter Jay had handed her that afternoon. The factory was gone. The last stable thing in their lives, ripped out from under them. Her stomach churned at the thought. She'd been holding their finances together with duct tape and prayers for months. Now there was nothing left to hold on to. Miss Latrice? The soft voice snapped her out of her thoughts. It was Jada again, clutching a drawing of a house with stick figures in the yard. This is for you. Latrice crouched down to examine the picture. This is beautiful, Jada. Is this your family? Jada nodded, her little face glowing with pride. Yeah, that's me, and that's my mommy, and that's my daddy. He's in heaven, though. The words hit Latrice like a punch to the chest. Oh, baby, she said softly, brushing a hand over Jada's braids. This is a wonderful picture. Thank you for sharing it with me. Jada skipped away, leaving Latrice holding the drawing. Her fingers trembled as she folded it carefully and slipped it into her pocket. The daycare phone rang, jolting her back to the present. Latrice grabbed it off the wall, her voice steady despite the knot in her throat. Crestview Heights Daycare. This is Latrice speaking. Miss Thompson, it's Mrs. Murphy. I'm running late. Could you keep Tyrell for an extra 30 minutes? Latrice forced a smile, even though Mrs. Murphy was notorious for running late. Of course, ma'am. We'll see you soon. The call ended, and Latrice sighed. She couldn't afford to turn anyone away, not with the daycare barely scraping by. Her boss, Miss Shirley, had already hinted at cutting hours if enrollment didn't pick up. Miss Latrice, can I have a snack? Tyrell's voice broke through her thoughts. She turned to see the little boy staring up at her with wide eyes. His shirt was too small, and his shoes had holes in the toes. "Sure, sweetheart," she said, grabbing a pack of crackers from the cupboard. "Here you go." By the time Latrice locked up the daycare and stepped into the chilly evening air, her feet felt like lead. The streets were quiet, the distant rumble of traffic the only sound. She zipped her coat tighter and hurried toward the bus stop, clutching her purse close. The bus was late, as usual. Latrice tapped her foot impatiently, watching as a group of teenagers loitered across the street. She recognized a few of them, former students from the daycare, now older and harder. One of them, a lanky boy with a cigarette dangling from his lips, met her eyes and gave a small nod. Latrice looked away, her heart sinking. She remembered when that boy used to bring her macaroni necklaces and shyly ask for extra juice at snack time. At home, the sound of cartoons greeted her as she stepped through the door. Deja, their 6-year-old, was sprawled on the couch with her little brother, Marcus, both of them giggling at the animated antics on screen. "Hey, babies," Latrice said, setting her purse down. "Where's Daddy?" "In the backyard," Deja said, without looking away from the TV. Latrice peeked out the window to see Jay standing by the fence, a black and mild in his hand. She frowned. He hadn't smoked in years, not since Marcus was born. She joined him outside, the cold air biting at her skin. "You're smoking again?" Jay exhaled a stream of smoke, his eyes fixed on the dark street beyond. "Just one. It's been a day." Latrice crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "You think I don't know that? I'm the one who has to figure out how we're going to pay for groceries next week." Jay turned to her, his jaw tight. "You think I'm not trying? I've been out there all day looking for something. Anything. And what did you find?" His silence was answer enough. Latrice sighed, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. "I'm sorry. I don't know how much more of this I can take, Jay. The bills keep coming. The kids need stuff, and now your job is gone." "I know." "Latrice," he snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut through the night. Then, softer, "I know." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared burden hanging between them. "I'll figure something out," Jay said finally, his voice low but firm. Latrice wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. But as she looked at the man she loved, she couldn't shake the fear gnawing at her heart. Later that night, after the kids were asleep, Latrice sat at the kitchen table with the bills spread out before her. She scribbled numbers in the margins, trying to make the math work. No matter how she added and subtracted, the red ink always won. Her eyes burned with unshed tears, but she refused to let them fall. Tomorrow would come, and with it, another fight to survive. For now, all she could do was pray. Under the glow of a flickering streetlight, Marvin Slim Johnson leaned against the hood of his black Charger, surveying the block like a king watching over his kingdom. Crestview Heights was his domain. Every corner, every alley, every exchange passed under his watchful eye. He flicked ash from his cigar, the rich smell of tobacco mingling with the sharp tang of the city. Around him, the street was alive with quiet activity. Boys no older than 15 stood on corners, their eyes darting nervously as they waited for customers. A car rolled by slowly, its tinted windows a silent negotiation. Slim didn't need to watch every move. He had soldiers for that. What he cared about was the rhythm of the operation. Everything had to flow, like a symphony. Disruptions, whether from the cops, rival crews,
or reckless boys who didn't know the rules were unacceptable. "Yo, Slim," a voice called. Slim turned to see Rico jogging toward him, his breath visible in the chilly night air. Rico was one of his lieutenants, a wiry kid with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. "What's good?" Slim asked, his voice calm but commanding. Rico handed him a wad of cash, neatly folded. "That's from the west side. Numbers are down this week. Some fool been trying to move product through our turf." Slim's jaw tightened, but he didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. "Who?" "Don't know yet, but we'll find out. Word is, he's small time. Won't last long." Slim nodded, tucking the cash into his coat. "Make sure he don't, and keep the west side tight. I don't need no weak links." "Got it, boss." Rico jogged off, and Slim turned his attention back to the street. Business was good, but it was never good enough. The economy was hitting everyone hard, even the game. People had less money to spend, and the risk was growing. Cops were cracking down harder than ever, trying to clean up the streets for the developers itching to gentrify Crestview Heights. But Slim wasn't worried. He'd survived worse. The Charger's interior was a stark contrast to the streets outside. Soft leather seats, a pristine dashboard, and the faint smell of cologne. Slim reclined in the driver's seat, flipping through his phone. He paused on a name. J. Thompson. Slim smirked. Jay was one of the good ones, or at least he used to be. They'd grown up together running the same streets, but Jay had taken a different path. Marriage, kids, a factory job. He'd done everything right. And now look where it got him. Slim tapped the number and waited. Jay answered on the second ring. "Yo." Jay's voice was cautious, guarded. "Jay, what's good?" Slim said, his tone smooth. "I heard about the plant, man. That's rough. How you holding up?" There was a pause. "I'm good." Slim chuckled. "You ain't gotta lie to me, brother. Look, I know things are tight. You need some help, I got you. Ain't no shame in doing what you gotta do for your family." "I said I'm good," Jay repeated, his voice firmer this time. Slim didn't push. He didn't need to. Desperation was like water against rock. It wore people down over time. "All right," he said, "but if you change your mind, you know where to find me." An hour later, Slim was back at his condo, a sleek high-rise on the edge of downtown. The view from his balcony stretched over the city, the lights glittering like scattered diamonds. From here, Crestview Heights looked almost peaceful. Inside the condo was immaculate, every detail curated to perfection. Modern art hung on the walls, and the bar was stocked with expensive liquor. Slim poured himself a glass of whiskey, savoring the burn as he stared out over the city. He didn't come from money. Everything he had, he'd earned. Every dollar, every car, every piece of respect. People liked to judge him for how he made his money, but where were they when he was starving as a kid? When his mom worked 3 jobs and still couldn't keep the lights on? The streets had been his only option, and he'd made them work for him. Now, he was untouchable. At least, that's what he told himself. In the early hours of the morning, Slim met with his inner circle in a back room of a bar he owned. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with smoke and tension. Rico was there, along with Big Tone, a towering man who handled the crew's security, and Dion, Slim's accountant and oldest friend. "We need to expand," Slim said, his voice steady but firm. "West side ain't cutting it no more. We take the south side, we double our numbers." Big Tone frowned. "South side's controlled by Marcus Brown's crew. They ain't just gonna hand it over. They won't have a choice," Slim said, a hint of a smirk on his lips.
We move smart. Hit 'em where it hurts. They'll fold. Dayon leaned forward, his brow furrowed. And if they don't, things get messy, Slim. You sure it's worth it? Slim's gaze hardened. It's always worth it. You want to stay small. You stay small. Me? I'm building an empire. The room fell silent. Slim's word was final, and they all knew it. As the meeting broke up, Slim lingered behind, his mind racing. Expansion was risky, but stagnation was worse. He couldn't afford to lose momentum. Not now, when the neighborhood was on the brink of collapse. He thought about Jay again, about the quiet desperation in his voice. Jay was a good man, but good men didn't survive in Crestview Heights. Slim's empire wasn't just about money. It was about power, control. And if he had to drag a few people into the game to keep it running, so be it. Isaiah Dixon woke up to the sound of his baby brother crying in the next room. He groaned, rubbing his face as he sat up on the lumpy twin mattress. The cold bit through the thin blanket draped over his shoulders, and he cursed under his breath. Their apartment in Crestview Heights wasn't much. 2 small bedrooms, a peeling linoleum floor in the kitchen, and a radiator that worked when it felt like it. But it was home, and for the last 2 years, Isaiah had done everything he could to keep it that way. "Isaiah!" His mother's strained voice called from the living room. He pulled on a hoodie and shuffled out of the bedroom to find her pacing with the baby in her arms. Her uniform from the diner was wrinkled, and her hair was pulled back into a messy ponytail. "Can you take Malik? I gotta get to work, and Miss Carter's late again." Isaiah reached for his baby brother, cradling the infant against his chest. Malik immediately quieted, his big brown eyes blinking up at Isaiah. "You're good at this," his mom said with a weak smile. "Better than me sometimes." Isaiah shrugged, trying not to let her see how tired he was. At 17, he'd already grown accustomed to picking up the slack at home. His mom worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, and his dad had disappeared years ago. That left Isaiah to handle everything else: cooking, cleaning, taking care of Malik, and trying to stay on top of his schoolwork. "Don't forget to pick up Layla after school," his mom added as she grabbed her coat. "And thank you, baby, for everything." Isaiah nodded, watching her leave. He didn't say what he was really thinking, that he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep this up. After dropping Layla off at school and feeding Malik, Isaiah sat at the kitchen table with a notebook open in front of him. He was supposed to be working on a history paper, but the numbers scrawled in the margins told a different story. The rent was due in 2 weeks, and even with his mom's 2 jobs, they were short. Again. The eviction notice taped to the fridge was a constant reminder of how close they were to losing everything. Isaiah clenched his pen, his mind racing. He'd been applying for part-time jobs all over the city, but no one wanted to hire a high school kid with no experience. A knock at the door pulled him out of his thoughts. When he opened it, he found a familiar face leaning against the frame. "Isaiah," Slim said with a grin, his gold chain glinting in the sunlight. "How you doing, lil' man?" Isaiah stiffened. He hadn't seen Slim in years, but the man's reputation loomed large over the neighborhood. "What do you want?" Slim chuckled, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Relax. I ain't here to cause trouble. Just heard you've been struggling a bit. Thought I'd come by and see if I can help." Isaiah crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. "We don't need your kind of help." Slim raised an eyebrow, unbothered by the defiance.
That's cute, but let me ask you something. How's your mom gonna pay that rent? Huh? You got a plan? Isaiah didn't answer. He hated how easily Slim had zeroed in on their weakness.
Look, I'm not saying you gotta go all in, Slim continued, his voice smooth. Just do a few runs for me. Quick, easy money. You keep your head down, nobody'll even notice.
And if it means keeping a roof over your family's head, is it really so bad? Isaiah stared at the floor, his fists clenching. He wanted to say no, to throw Slim out and slam the door behind him, but the eviction notice flashed in his mind, and the weight of his family's survival pressed down on his shoulders. I'll think about it, he muttered. Slim smiled, patting him on the back. That's all I ask. You know where to find me. That night, Isaiah lay awake in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling. Malik's soft snores filled the room, and in the faint light from the street lamp outside, he could see Layla's little form curled up on her mattress. He felt trapped, like the walls were closing in on him. No matter how hard he tried, it was never enough. The world didn't care about kids like him. Kids who had to grow up too fast, who carried the weight of their families on their backs. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. Slim. Think faster. Clock's ticking. Isaiah stared at the message, his heart pounding. The next morning, he walked Layla to school, her tiny hand clutching his. She chattered about a field trip to the zoo, her excitement bubbling over. Do you think Mama will let me go? She asked, looking up at him with hopeful eyes. Isaiah swallowed the lump in his throat. He knew the answer already. The $20 fee for the trip might as well have been $200. We'll see, he said, ruffling her hair. As he walked back home, his phone buzzed again. Slim's message was short and to the point. Meet me at the corner of 8th and Maple. Isaiah stopped, staring at the screen. This was it. The choice he'd been avoiding. He could keep struggling, hoping for a miracle that wasn't coming. Or he could take Slim up on his offer and risk everything. For his mom, for Layla, for Malik. Isaiah shoved the phone in his pocket and turned toward 8th and Maple. The sound of the baby monitor buzzed faintly on the kitchen counter as Jay Thompson stared at the stack of bills spread out before him. The weight of it all felt like a vice tightening around his chest. Mortgage payments were overdue, the utility company had sent a disconnection notice, and the credit card debt had spiraled out of control. He clenched his fists, his frustration bubbling to the surface. Losing his job at the factory had been a blow, but now, after weeks of fruitless job hunting, it was becoming clear. No one was hiring. Latrice walked in, her hair wrapped in a scarf, exhaustion etched into her face. She set a plate of leftover spaghetti in front of him and sat down, pulling the baby monitor closer. You eat yet? She asked softly. Jay shook his head. Not hungry. You got to eat something. You've been running yourself into the ground. He looked at her, his jaw tight. And for what, Latrice? I've been out there every day, filling out applications, standing in line, making calls. Nobody's hiring. They don't care about a man like me. They don't care about any of us, she said, her voice tinged with bitterness. But we still have to find a way. Jay pushed the plate away, leaning back in his chair. What way? Huh? You tell me, Latrice, because I'm running out of options. Her eyes softened, and she reached for his hand. We'll figure it out. We always do. But her voice lacked conviction, and they both knew it. Later that night, Jay sat on the porch, a bottle of cheap beer in his hand. The streets of Crestview Heights were quiet, the distant hum of sirens the only sound. He thought about his father, a proud man who'd worked construction his whole life, Even when times were tough, his dad had always found a way to provide. Jay had looked up to him, wanted to be just like him. But this wasn't the world his father had lived in. The factory had been his last shot at stability, the only thing keeping him from drowning. Now, with 2 kids and a wife depending on him, Jay felt like he was sinking fast. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the silence. He pulled it out and saw Slim's name on the screen. He hesitated. Slim had been reaching out more often lately, dropping hints about opportunities Jay didn't want to consider. But the desperation in his gut told him it might be time to pick up. Jay let the call go to voicemail, but a text came through moments later. "Yo, I got something for you. Real money. Hit me up." He stared at the screen, his mind racing. He'd sworn he'd never go back to that life. Selling drugs was something he'd left behind years ago, back when he was just a reckless kid trying to make a name for himself. But now, he thought about Latrice's tired eyes, about the way Deja had asked for new shoes last week and how he'd had to tell her, "Not now." He thought about the stack of bills on the kitchen table, each one a ticking time bomb.
The next morning, Jay found himself outside Slim's condo. He hated being there, hated what it meant, but he couldn't see any other way. Slim opened the door with a grin, gold teeth flashing. "Jay, man, it's been too long. Come on in." The condo was as flashy as Jay remembered. Leather couches, flat-screen TVs, and a view of the city that screamed money. Slim poured them both a drink and gestured for Jay to sit. "I heard about the factory," Slim said, sliding a glass across the table. "That's rough, man. Real rough. But you know, sometimes life pushes us back to where we started." Jay didn't respond, staring into the amber liquid in his glass. Slim leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Look, I know you're not trying to go back to the streets. You got your family. You're a good dude. But this ain't about you, Jay. It's about them. You can't let pride get in the way of putting food on the table." Jay looked up, meeting Slim's gaze. "What do you want from me?" Slim smirked. "I just need someone I can trust. A few runs, nothing big. You'll make more in a week than you ever did at that factory." Jay shook his head. "I don't know, man. That life, it's dangerous." "Everything's dangerous," Slim said, leaning back. "But you're a smart guy. You know how to stay low. Keep your head down. Ain't nobody gonna mess with you." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Jay thought about his family, about the empty fridge and the eviction notice. Finally, he nodded. "All right, I'll do it." The first run was easier than Jay expected. Slim handed him a small package and told him to drop it off at an address across town. No questions, no complications. When Jay returned, Slim handed him a stack of cash, more money than Jay had made in a month at the factory. For a moment, he felt relief. The weight on his shoulders lightened, and he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this could work. But as he drove home, the doubts crept in. He thought about Deja and Marcus, about the example he was setting for them. He thought about Latrice and the promises he'd made to her. That night, as he lay in bed beside his wife, the money hidden in a shoebox under the bed, Jay stared at the ceiling. He told himself it was temporary, just until they got back on their feet. But deep down, he knew the streets had a way of pulling you in and not letting go. Latrice Thompson stood in the kitchen, her hands submerged in soapy water as she scrubbed last night's dishes. She glanced at the stack of bills on the counter, feeling the familiar pang of anxiety. The overdue notices had become a permanent fixture in their home, a grim reminder of how close they were to losing everything. Jay had been different lately. Distant, distracted. He wasn't the man she'd married, the man who used to hold her at night and promise her they'd always find a way. She knew the stress of losing his job was eating at him, but there was something else, something he wasn't telling her. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Jay walked in, his face set in a neutral mask. He carried a brown paper bag in one hand and a six-pack of beer in the other. "You're home early," she said, drying her hands on a dish towel. Jay set the bag on the counter and kissed her cheek. "Figured I'd spend some time with the kids." She gave him a skeptical look. "Since when?" "You've been out late every night this week." Jay avoided her gaze, pulling a beer from the pack and twisting off the cap. "Just handling some stuff. You don't need to worry about it." Latrice crossed her arms. "Jay, what's going on? Don't give me that everything's fine nonsense. I know you." He hesitated, the beer halfway to his lips. "It's nothing, Latrice. I've just been looking for ways to make some money." Her eyes narrowed. "What kind of ways?" Jay sighed, setting the beer down. "It's legit. Don't worry about it." But the way he said it made her worry even more. That night, while Jay was in the shower, Latrice's curiosity got the better of her. She rummaged through his things, searching for anything that might explain his recent behavior. When she didn't find anything in his coat or pockets, she knelt beside the bed and slid her hand underneath. Her fingers brushed against something solid. She pulled out a shoebox and opened it. Her heart sank when she saw the stacks of cash inside. Latrice sat back on her heels, the box in her lap. The money was neatly bundled, far too much for someone who was unemployed to have on hand. Her mind raced as she tried to piece it together. She thought about the late nights, the vague answers, the tension in his shoulders every time she asked how his day had gone. "Jay," she whispered to herself, her chest tightening. When Jay came out of the bathroom, toweling off his hair, he found Latrice sitting on the edge of the bed, the shoebox at her feet. He froze. "What are you doing?" She looked up at him, her eyes filled with anger and betrayal. "You tell me, where did all this come from?" Jay's jaw tightened. "It's not what you think." "Then what is it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're doing something illegal." He sat down across from her, his shoulders slumping. "Latrice, I didn't have a choice. We're drowning here. I had to do something." "You had to do this?" she snapped, gesturing to the money. "Jay, we talked about this. We said we wouldn't go back to that life." "That was before," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Before I lost my job, before the bills started piling up, before I saw the look in Deja's eyes when I told her we couldn't afford a pair of shoes." Latrice flinched, but didn't back down. "And what happens when the cops show up? Or worse, when some thug decides you're stepping on his turf? What happens to me, to the kids?" Jay ran a hand over his face, his frustration boiling over. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't lie awake at night wondering if this is gonna blow up in my face? But what was I supposed to do, Latrice? Tell me, what was I supposed to do?" She didn't answer, her silence louder than any argument. The tension hung heavy in the air as they sat across from each other, both too stubborn to speak. Finally, Latrice stood up, wrapping her arms around herself. "I can't do this, Jay. I can't sit here and watch you throw your life away. I need to know that we're gonna be okay, that you're gonna be here for us." He looked up at her, his expression pained. I'm doing this for us. No, she said quietly. You're doing this for yourself. Because you can't handle feeling powerless. And now, you're dragging us down with you. Her words cut deep, and Jay didn't respond. Latrice grabbed a blanket from the closet and headed for the couch. I need some time to think, she said over her shoulder. Jay watched her go, the weight of her disappointment settling heavily on his chest. As Latrice lay awake on the couch, the baby monitor buzzing faintly beside her, she thought about the man she'd married. She thought about the promises they'd made, the life they'd dreamed of building together. She didn't want to lose him, but she didn't know if she could save him either. And as much as she hated to admit it, a small part of her understood why he'd done it. But understanding didn't make it right. The sun set slowly over Crestview Heights, casting a warm golden glow over the run-down blocks where children played in the streets. Families sat on porches, and everyone knew each other's business. It wasn't a perfect neighborhood, but it was home. And despite everything, the economic strain, the gang activity, the tight grip of poverty, there was a sense of community. But that was beginning to change. Isaiah had never felt more conflicted in his life. The money was tempting. $200 for a simple job with no questions asked. It was more than his mom made in a week at the diner. It was enough to keep them afloat for a while. But every time he thought about it, the weight of what he was considering pressed down on him harder. On his way back from meeting Slim, Isaiah couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to spiral. He passed Mrs. Johnson's house, where she always sat on her porch, watching over the block like a hawk. She'd seen him grow up, and every time their eyes met, he could feel the judgment in her gaze. He knew if he took that step, there was no going back. The streets had a way of pulling you in, and once you were in, they didn't let you out. Jay Thompson walked through the neighborhood, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, trying to shake off the guilt gnawing at his insides. It had been days since his argument with Latrice, and things had only gotten worse. She barely spoke to him now. The tension was unbearable. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep this charade up, pretending that he had everything under control, when all he felt was like he was on the edge of a precipice. He wasn't the only one feeling the pressure. Word had spread fast in Crestview Heights about the increase in drug activity. Jay could see the subtle shifts in his neighbors, the whispers that had turned into stares when he walked by. It wasn't just Slim's influence. It was everywhere. In every corner store, in every alley, on every block. Some of the men he'd once called friends had already crossed that line. Even if Jay hadn't been involved directly, his silence was loud. He was implicated just by association. He stopped in front of Mrs. Harris's house, where the familiar sound of laughter and music spilled out from the open door. Mrs. Harris was the neighborhood matriarch, and her husband had been a pillar of the community before he passed. She was one of the few people who still kept her faith in the neighborhood, who refused to let the hardship define her. But even she was starting to look tired. Jay knocked on the door, and Mrs. Harris opened it with a weary smile. "Jay, it's been a while. Come on in." He stepped inside, greeted by the smell of cornbread and fried chicken. Comforting scents, like everything was normal. "Everything all right, Mrs. Harris?" Jay asked, taking a seat at the kitchen table. "Depends on how you look at it," she said with a sigh, her hands wiping a dishcloth over the counter. "Things have been tough around here lately. Can't even send the kids out to play without worrying about who they're running into." Jay nodded, feeling the weight of her words. Yeah, I've noticed. It's changing fast. She turned to face him, her eyes sharp. You look like you've got something on your mind, Jay. Something I need to know about? Jay hesitated, then decided to be honest. Mrs. Harris had always been a voice of reason. Maybe she could give him some guidance. I got involved with Slim, he admitted quietly, his voice almost drowned out by the sound of the baby crying next door. Her face didn't change, but her gaze grew harder. I see. And how's that working out for you? I don't know. The money's good, but... He trailed off, unsure of how to finish. But it's not worth losing yourself over. She finished for him, her tone unyielding. Jay exhaled sharply. Yeah, I know. But what else am I supposed to do? I can't find work anywhere. And I'm failing my family. Mrs. Harris set down the dishcloth and took a seat across from him. Jay, you've got a family. You've got kids who need their father. You can't buy them everything they want, but you can show them that you're a man of integrity, a man who stands by his values, no matter how hard things get. Jay clenched his fists. It's hard, Mrs. Harris. Everything's harder these days. She nodded, her eyes softening. I know, child. But there's a difference between struggling and compromising your soul. Isaiah, still walking down the street after his meeting with Slim, found himself at the corner of 8th and Maple. The streetlights flickered above him, casting a dim light on the tired buildings around him. He could hear the hum of conversations coming from the windows above. Neighbors discussing the same things. The violence in the streets, the poverty that seemed to grow every day, and the feeling that no matter what you did, it was never enough. He looked up and saw a familiar figure, leaning against the lamppost, a smirk on his face. It was Slim. Isaiah hesitated, but then walked toward him, the uncertainty thick in the air. You make your choice yet? Slim asked, his eyes glinting in the streetlight. Isaiah didn't answer right away. He knew this was it, the moment that would define him. Either he took that step and joined the game, or he walked away and found another way to survive. I don't know, Isaiah said, his voice barely above a whisper. Slim laughed, pushing off the lamppost and stepping closer. You don't have to know right now, but just know that you're running out of options. This neighborhood, it's changing, man. People don't wait around for handouts anymore. They take what they need. Isaiah's heart raced as he stood there, his mind spinning. He thought about Malik, about Layla, about his mom. He thought about the bills at home, the way his family was counting on him. But then, a voice in his head cut through the haze of his thoughts. You don't have to do this. Not like this. Isaiah turned away from Slim, his feet heavy on the pavement as he walked off into the night. He wasn't sure where he was going, but he knew he couldn't let this life swallow him whole. Jay walked back down the street, his mind clouded by the conversation with Mrs. Harris. The weight of his decisions pressed down on him like an anvil, but he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to take a turn. The neighborhood was changing. No doubt about it. People were desperate, the pressure mounting with each passing day. But Jay wasn't ready to give up just yet. Not without a fight. As he approached his front door, the sound of a car engine rumbled behind him. He turned to see Slim's black SUV roll past, the windows tinted so dark that he couldn't see inside. The car slowed, and Jay felt his stomach drop. He knew Slim wasn't going to give him a choice for long. With a sigh, Jay stepped inside, the door closing behind him.
The following week was a blur of uncertainty and tension. The once vibrant streets of Crestview Heights had taken on a darker tone, and Jay Thompson felt it in his bones every time he stepped outside. Neighbors who once greeted him with smiles now avoided his gaze. The whispers followed him, their sharp edges cutting through the air. Latrice hadn't spoken to him much since their argument. The silence between them had grown thicker, a constant reminder of the distance between them.
Jay's nights were sleepless, his mind running through the choices he'd made, the choices that had led him to this point. He tried to focus on the money, the stacks he'd stashed under the bed. But every time he looked at it, the guilt gnawed at him. It wasn't just the money. It was what it meant. It was the slippery slope that would drag him deeper into the world he'd sworn he'd left behind. Isaiah sat in his bedroom, staring at his phone. Slim's text sat unread, the offer dangling in front of him like a lifeline. But Isaiah wasn't sure if he could pull himself out if he grabbed it. He thought about his mother, how hard she worked to keep them afloat, and how she looked at him every time he came home later than usual. He thought about Layla, his little sister, who had begun to ask too many questions about where Isaiah was going. Just one more time, Slim had promised. One more job. After that, you'll be set. You can take care of your family. But Isaiah knew it wouldn't stop there. There was no just one more time in this world. Once you got in, it was a lifetime. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the block. He watched as the older men hung out on the corner, talking in low voices, passing glances. They were too busy with their own problems to notice the kids, the young ones who were starting to pay attention, starting to mimic what they saw. He wondered how many of them had started out like him, looking for a way out of the cycle, only to fall deeper into it. The knock at the door broke his reverie. He opened it to find Maurice standing in the hallway, his face tight with worry. "Yo, you good?" Maurice asked, leaning against the doorframe. Isaiah nodded, though he wasn't sure if it was true. "Yeah, just thinking." Maurice studied him for a moment before speaking. "I saw you talking to Slim. You know he's not offering you a way out, right?" Isaiah swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his friend's words. "I'm not sure what's left for me, man. I gotta take care of my family." Maurice shook his head. "There's other ways, bro. You don't need to go down that path. I've seen too many dudes get pulled in. And they don't get out. Not unless they're lucky. And we ain't lucky." Isaiah didn't respond. He knew Maurice was right, but the pressure, the constant need to provide, had him trapped. He could feel it tightening around him like a noose. "Just think about it," Maurice said quietly. "You got more options than you think." Isaiah nodded, but the doubt in his chest didn't go away. Meanwhile, Jay sat in the living room, watching the news on low volume. The tension in the house was unbearable. Latrice had gone to bed early, taking the kids with her. There was no yelling, no more arguments, just silence. He couldn't remember the last time they had a real conversation, the kind where they laughed together, talked about their day, or made plans for the future. Now it was all about surviving. It was all about putting one foot in front of the other. The doorbell rang, snapping him out of his thoughts. Jay stood up, his heart skipping a beat, and made his way to the door. When he opened it, Slim was standing there, his SUV idling in the background. "Yo," Slim said, glancing over his shoulder to make sure no one was watching. "We gotta talk." Jay sighed but stepped outside, closing the door quietly behind him. "What is it, Slim?" "I got something bigger for you, man," Slim said. with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Something that'll get you right. It's time to move up, Jay." Jay shook his head, his mind a swirl of doubts. "I told you, man. I'm out. I'm done with that life." Slim's expression shifted, his voice dropping to something more serious. "You don't get to walk away, Jay. Not now. You think this neighborhood is going to forget what you did? They're watching you, bro. They're waiting for you to slip up. But if you roll with me, we'll set you up. You won't have to worry about anything. Not bills, not rent. Nothing." Jay clenched his fists, his pulse quickening. "I don't want your money, Slim. I don't want this life. I want to be here for my family, man. I want to show my kids something better." Slim stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "You think your kids are going to respect you if you can't put food on the table? If they see you failing every single day? They're going to grow up knowing their father couldn't provide. You think that's going to inspire them?" Jay flinched, the words stinging harder than he expected. But Slim wasn't done. "You've got one shot to make it. Don't throw it away." Jay stood there in silence, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He wanted to fight. He wanted to turn away, to walk back into the house and shut the door on everything Slim represented. But in the back of his mind, he knew Slim was right about one thing. He couldn't keep failing. And in that moment, the pull of the streets seemed stronger than his desire to be a better man. The next morning, Jay stood in the kitchen, staring at his reflection in the window. He heard Latrice moving around upstairs, getting the kids ready for school. He was about to make a decision that would change everything. The doorbell rang again, but this time he knew it wasn't Slim. It was Maurice. The young man looked at Jay with something like pity in his eyes. "You know, you can't keep doing this, right?" Maurice said softly, stepping inside. "This ain't the way." Jay's jaw tightened, but the words lodged in his throat. He had no answer. "Do you want your kids to grow up like this?" Maurice continued, "struggling and fighting just to survive?" Jay finally looked away, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what else to do, Malik. I just don't know what else to do." Maurice shook his head, frustration creeping into his voice. "There's always another way, Jay. You just have to find it." Jay stared at him, feeling the weight of his choices. He wasn't sure if he could make the right one anymore, but one thing was clear. He couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Latrice Thompson sat in the quiet of her bedroom, the soft hum of the fan a distant background noise. The kids were at school and Jay was out, probably meeting with Slim again. She couldn't escape the feeling that something was breaking, something deep within her family, and the weight of it crushed her chest every day. She had watched Jay slowly slip away, pull deeper into the world he had promised he'd leave behind. Every time he came home late, the silence between them grew more suffocating. She had spent years supporting him, waiting for him to change, to rise above the poverty, to make something of himself. But the harder things got, the more distant he became. Latrice had grown tired of waiting. Her hands shook slightly as she set down the phone she had just used to make a call. She'd decided to take matters into her own hands. No longer would she let her family's future rest solely in Jay's hands. She grabbed her purse and jacket, her eyes glinting with determination. She had always been the backbone of the household, but she was about to show Jay and everyone else that she was capable of more than just being a passive bystander. She wasn't going to sit idly by while the world crumbled around her. Latrice had always dreamed of owning a business, something that would give her the financial independence she'd never had. She wanted to create something for herself, something that wasn't dependent on the whims of a struggling job market or the pressures of a failing relationship. For months, she'd been saving every penny she could, despite the odds. She had enrolled in a night class at the community college to get certified as a cosmetologist. She had started small, doing hair for friends and family, and taking on any job that would give her a little extra cash. Her hands were skilled, and her reputation had begun to grow in the neighborhood. People trusted her, and she had always known how to make them feel beautiful. Now, she was ready to take the next step. As she stepped out of her front door, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Jay. "I'm going to be late tonight. Got some stuff to handle." She stared at the message for a moment, her stomach twisting in frustration. He was always going to be late. But something had shifted in her. She wasn't angry anymore. She was tired. Latrice walked with purpose, her heels clicking on the sidewalk as she made her way to the local beauty supply store. She'd spoken with the owner earlier that week about renting a space inside the shop. She knew it wasn't going to be easy, but this was her shot. When she arrived, the shop was quieter than usual, the hum of blow dryers and clinking scissors filling the air. She approached the owner, Miss Jenkins, who had a welcoming smile on her face. "Latrice, I'm glad you came by. Ready to sign that lease?" Miss Jenkins asked, wiping her hands on her apron. Latrice nodded, her heart racing. "Yes, I am." The two women shook hands, and just like that, it was official. Latrice was stepping into her future, despite the chaos. She would build something for herself, and even if Jay didn't follow, she knew she'd be okay. The day after Latrice signed the lease, the tension between her and Jay reached its breaking point. She had kept her emotions in check, focusing on her new business venture. But Jay's increasing detachment and the lingering dark cloud of his involvement with Slim had her on edge. That evening, Jay finally came home, looking worn and defeated. His eyes were heavy, the weight of the world sitting on his shoulders. Latrice was standing in the kitchen, preparing dinner for the kids. "You're late," she said, her voice calm, though her mind was racing. Jay didn't respond right away. He was exhausted, physically and mentally. He had never wanted things to go this way, but his choices had led him here. He had made too many compromises, crossed too many lines, and now everything felt like it was slipping through his fingers. Latrice turned to face him, her hands placed firmly on her hips. "We need to talk." Jay raised his eyebrows but didn't speak. He knew where this was going. "I'm not doing this anymore," Latrice said, her voice firm but steady. "I'm not waiting for you to change. I'm not going to sit here and let you drag us down with you." Jay's chest tightened. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about me," Latrice replied. "I'm taking control of my future. I've been doing everything for everyone else for so long. I've put my dreams on hold, but I can't do it anymore. I'm opening my own salon." Jay froze. "What? You're serious?" "I'm serious, Jay. I've been serious for a while now. I've been working behind the scenes, saving every penny I could, getting certified. And now, I've got a space in the beauty supply store." Jay didn't know how to respond. His first instinct was to feel threatened. He was the man of the house, wasn't he? Shouldn't he be the one making the big decisions? But deep down, he knew she was right. "You're going to do this without me?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. Latrice stood her ground, but her expression softened. "Jay, you've been slipping away from us for months. You've been so focused on the streets, on everything but us. I've waited, but I can't wait anymore. I have to take care of me. Jay stood there, unable to speak, feeling a sense of loss wash over him. He knew this moment was coming, but it didn't make it any easier. I'm not leaving you, Jay, Latrice continued. But I'm not waiting for you to get your act together anymore either. I'm doing this for me, for our kids. I'm not going to let our future be defined by your mistakes. For the first time in months, Jay felt something stir inside him. It wasn't anger or resentment. It was guilt. And it was the first real feeling he had experienced in a long time. He looked at Latrice. Really looked at her for the first time in a while. She wasn't the same woman he had married, the one who always tried to keep everything together. She was stronger now, more determined, and the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. Latrice, his voice cracked, and for a moment, he didn't know how to continue. She took a deep breath and gave him a soft smile. You can still change, Jay, but it has to be for you. For us. Not for anyone else. Not for Slim. Not for the streets. Jay nodded slowly, feeling something in him begin to shift. He wasn't sure how he was going to get out of this mess, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had to try. For Latrice, for the kids, for himself. The next few weeks were filled with tension. But there was a spark of hope that had been missing for a long time. Latrice dove headfirst into her business, juggling the new salon with being a mother and a wife. Jay tried to put his demons behind him, but he knew it wasn't going to be easy. Every step he took away from the streets felt like a battle. But every time he looked at Latrice, he remembered why he had to fight. Why he had to get back on track. The neighborhood was changing, but so were they. And maybe, just maybe, they could still change their own destinies. Kimberly Kim Carter adjusted her camera strap, her notepad tucked tightly under her arm as she surveyed the streets of Crestview Heights. The decline of the once thriving neighborhood had been steady and devastating, and Kim was determined to capture its story. As a journalist for a regional newspaper, Kim had spent her career reporting on communities often overlooked by mainstream media. Crestview Heights wasn't just a story to her. It was her old neighborhood. She had grown up playing on these streets, attending the local church, and watching her parents work tirelessly to give her a better life. Now, the boarded-up shops and rising crime felt like a betrayal to everything the neighborhood once stood for. Her latest piece, A City Unraveled, The Struggles of Crestview Heights, aimed to uncover the truth behind the area's economic collapse and the growing tensions between residents and those who had turned to crime for survival. Kim stood on the corner of Maple and Vine, where a group of older men played dominoes under the shade of a tree. She approached cautiously, her notebook in hand. "Excuse me, gentlemen," she began, her voice calm and professional. "I'm a journalist working on a piece about Crestview Heights. I'd like to hear your thoughts on what's been happening here." One of the men, a wiry figure named Earl, eyed her suspiciously. "Why you care? Ain't nobody ever cared about this place before. Now you want to write some article about how bad it is?" Kim held his gaze, her expression earnest. "Because this story needs to be told. People need to understand what's happening here. Not just the struggles, but the resilience too. You have a voice, and it deserves to be heard." Earl studied her for a moment before nodding. "All right, but don't sugarcoat it. This place ain't what it used to be. You got families barely making it, kids dropping out of school, and good folks turning to bad choices because they don't see no other way." Kim jotted down his words, her heart heavy with the weight of their truth. Later that afternoon, Kim met with Pastor Daniels at the community center next to his church.
A towering man with a booming voice and a heart of gold, Pastor Daniels had been a fixture in the neighborhood for decades. He ran food drives, organized youth programs, and spent countless nights counseling those on the brink of despair. "Kim," he said warmly as she entered his office, "it's been too long." "It has, Pastor," Kim replied, smiling. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with me." The pastor motioned for her to sit, his expression growing serious. "This neighborhood is bleeding, Kim. I've buried too many young men, counseled too many mothers who've lost their sons. The streets have taken over, and it feels like the city's just watching us drown." Kim's pen moved swiftly across her notepad. "Why do you think things have gotten so bad?" "Neglect," he said without hesitation. "Neglect from the city, neglect from those who left and didn't look back, but it's more than that. It's despair. When people don't see a way out, they give up. They turn to whatever gets them through the day, even if it destroys them." The conversation lasted for over an hour, the pastor's words painting a vivid picture of the community's struggles and his relentless efforts to help. As Kim and Pastor Daniels walked back to the main hall of the community center, their discussion was interrupted by a group of young men loitering near the entrance. Slim was among them, his eyes narrowing as he noticed Kim's notepad and recorder. "What you doing here, lady?" Slim called out, his tone sharp. Kim stood her ground, meeting his gaze. "I'm a journalist. I'm here to tell the story of Crestview Heights." Slim chuckled, a menacing sound. "Story, huh? What kind of story you think you gonna tell? You think you know us? Know what it's like out here?" Pastor Daniels stepped forward, his voice firm but calm. "Slim, she's here to help, to shine a light on what's happening in this neighborhood." Slim's grin faded, his expression hardening. "Ain't nobody need no light. What we need is folks to mind their own business." One of Slim's boys muttered something under his breath, and Kim caught the words snitch and troublemaker. Her pulse quickened, but she refused to back down. "I'm not here to judge," she said evenly. "I'm here to listen, to understand." Slim took a step closer, his tone laced with warning. "You better be careful who you talk to. Some folks don't like their business being aired out." Pastor Daniels placed a protective hand on Kim's shoulder. "That's enough, Slim. You've made your point." Slim glared at the pastor but didn't push further. With a nod to his crew, he turned and walked away, leaving an uneasy silence in his wake. Kim exhaled, her hands trembling slightly. "Does this happen often?" she asked the pastor. "More than I'd like to admit," he replied. "But don't let them scare you, Kim. The truth needs to come out, no matter how uncomfortable it makes people." Kim nodded, her resolve hardening. She knew the risks of exposing the raw truths of Crestview Heights, but she also knew it was a story worth telling. Word of Kim's project spread quickly through the neighborhood, and reactions were mixed. Some residents welcomed her efforts, hoping her work would bring much-needed attention to their plight. Others, like Slim and his crew, viewed her as a threat. Jay heard about Kim's interviews from Malik, who had spoken to her earlier in the week. The idea of someone digging into the neighborhood's problems made Jay uneasy. He had too much to lose if certain truths came to light. Meanwhile, Latrice found herself drawn to Kim's work. She admired the journalist's courage and began attending Pastor Daniels's community meetings, where Kim often shared her progress. For Latrice, it was a chance to connect with others who believed in change and to find a glimmer of hope amid the chaos. As Kim and Pastor Daniels continued their work, They began to uncover troubling patterns: corruption in the local government, landlords exploiting tenants, and systemic barriers that kept the community trapped in poverty.
But their efforts didn't go unnoticed by the powers that be. Threatening letters were slipped under the church door, and Kim's car was vandalized one night as she worked late in the community center. Despite the danger, Kim and Pastor Daniels pressed on, forming unlikely alliances with residents like Latrice, who offered her salon as a meeting space, and even Maurice, who began volunteering at the center. The tension in the neighborhood reached a boiling point when a protest organized by Pastor Daniels drew both supporters and detractors. Slim and his crew showed up, their presence a silent warning, but Kim and the pastor refused to back down. Their message was clear: Crestview Heights would not be forgotten. Jay sat on the worn couch in Isaiah's living room, staring blankly at the flickering television. It was late, and the streets outside hummed with muted chaos. Cars speeding by, laughter spilling from stoops, and the occasional blare of a siren. He had just come from a meeting with Slim, and his mind felt like it was being pulled in two directions. "I'm tired, Zay," Jay said finally, breaking the silence. Isaiah looked up from the PlayStation controller in his hand, his expression unreadable. "Tired of what, man?" Jay leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "All of it. The hustling, the late nights, the feeling like I'm one wrong move away from losing everything." He paused, his voice dropping. "I'm losing Latrice. She's out here making moves, building a future for herself and the kids, and I'm just stuck." Isaiah nodded slowly. He had been feeling the same weight for months. The money they made on the streets wasn't the dream they'd once imagined. It barely covered their needs, and it came with sleepless nights, paranoia, and the constant threat of violence. "You think I don't feel the same way?" Isaiah said, his voice bitter. "I hate this life too, Jay, but what else we got? You think anybody out there is going to give two felons a shot? Every job application I fill out goes straight in the trash as soon as they see my record." Jay sighed, running a hand over his face. "I don't know, man, but I can't keep doing this. Slim's got us running harder and taking bigger risks, and one of these days, it's all gonna come crashing down." Isaiah set the controller down, his eyes narrowing. "You saying we just walk away? You think Slim's gonna let us go that easy?" Jay met his gaze, his jaw tightening. "I don't know what I'm saying. I just know we gotta find a way out." The next day, Jay visited the community center. He hadn't been inside the building in years, not since he was a teenager playing pickup basketball after school. But something about Pastor Daniel's quiet determination had stuck with him. Maybe, just maybe, the pastor could help him figure out a way forward. Jay found the pastor in the main hall, setting up chairs for an upcoming meeting. "Pastor Daniels?" Jay called out, his voice hesitant. The older man turned, his face breaking into a warm smile. "Jay, it's good to see you here. What can I do for you?" Jay shifted uncomfortably, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "I need help, Pastor. I'm trying to get out of the streets, but I don't even know where to start." The pastor set down the chair he was holding and approached Jay, his expression serious. "That's a big step, son. The fact that you're even here tells me you're ready to make a change. But you've got to be prepared for how hard it's going to be. You build a life in the streets, and walking away won't be easy." "I know," Jay said quietly, "but I can't keep living like this. I want to be better. For my kids, for Latrice, for myself." The pastor placed a hand on Jay's shoulder. "You're not alone in this.
We'll figure it out together. Let's start with finding you some work. Something to get you back on your feet. That night, Jay sat down with Isaiah in the dimly lit kitchen of Isaiah's apartment. I talked to Pastor Daniels, Jay began, his voice steady. He's going to help me find a job. Isaiah frowned. You serious about this, huh? Yeah, I am. And you should think about it too, Zay. We can't keep doing this. It's not just the cops or Slim we got to worry about. It's the life itself. It eats you up. Isaiah leaned back in his chair, the weight of the conversation settling over him. He wanted to believe there was a way out, but he'd been burned too many times before. You really think you can make it out, Jay? Isaiah asked, his voice laced with doubt. Jay nodded. I think we can, but it's going to take both of us. Slim ain't going to let me walk away alone, and you know it. All right, Isaiah said finally. I'm in, but we got to play this smart. Slim ain't just going to let us go. The next few weeks were tense as Jay and Isaiah began quietly stepping back from Slim's operations. They took fewer jobs, avoided high-risk deals, and started spending more time at the community center. Pastor Daniels introduced them to a network of local business owners willing to give second chances, and Jay landed a part-time job at a warehouse. But Slim wasn't blind to their retreat. One evening, as Jay and Isaiah left the community center, Slim was waiting for them outside. His crew stood nearby, their faces shadowed by the dim streetlights. You two got something to tell me? Slim asked, his voice calm but menacing. Jay swallowed hard, stepping forward. Yeah, we're done, Slim. We're out. Slim's eyes narrowed. Out? Ain't no out, Jay. You think you can just walk away after everything we've been through? After everything I've done for you? Isaiah stepped up beside Jay, his tone steady. We're grateful for what you did, Slim. But we're done. We got families to think about. Slim chuckled darkly. Families? That's what this is about? You think your family's gonna eat when you got no money? You think these streets gonna forget you just because you want to play house? Jay held his ground. We'll figure it out, but we can't do this anymore. Slim's smile faded, and for a moment, the tension was suffocating. Then he nodded slowly, his expression hardening. All right, you want to go? Go. But don't come crying to me when the world out there chews you up and spits you out. As Jay and Isaiah walked away, their hearts pounding, they knew the hardest part was still ahead. The streets wouldn't let them go easily, but for the first time in years, they felt something they hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Jay knew the streets didn't let people go easily. Even as he moved further into his job at the warehouse and began making small strides toward rebuilding his life, there was an uneasiness that followed him like a shadow. Isaiah had started picking up shifts at a mechanic's shop, slowly carving out a new normal for himself as well. They were trying to live clean, but they both knew Slim wasn't finished with them. It started subtly. Rumors spread about Jay being soft and Isaiah forgetting where he came from. Slim's people hung around the community center more often, watching, waiting. Then came the text. It was late one evening when Jay's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and felt his stomach drop. Slim, we need to talk. You owe me one last thing. Tomorrow, 9 p.m. Don't be late. Jay's hands clenched into fists. He knew this wasn't a request. It was a demand. The next night, Jay stood outside an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town, his heart pounding in his chest. He had debated not showing up, but he couldn't risk what Slim might do to Latrice or the kids if he didn't. Isaiah had wanted to come with him, but Jay had insisted on going alone. I can't drag you into this anymore, Zay, he'd said. This is my mess to clean up.
The inside of the warehouse was dimly lit, the air thick with the stench of mildew and motor oil. Slim was waiting for him, flanked by two of his guys. A young man Jay didn't recognize was kneeling on the floor, his hands tied behind his back and a gag in his mouth. "What's this?" Jay asked, his voice wary. Slim smirked, his arms crossed over his chest. "You want out, right? Well, here's your chance to prove your loyalty one last time. Take care of this." Jay's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" Slim nodded toward the kneeling man. "He's a snitch. Told the cops about one of our drops last week. You take him out, and we're square. You're free." Jay stared at the man, his chest tightening. The guy couldn't have been more than 20, his eyes wide with terror. "I'm not doing this, Slim," Jay said, his voice shaking. "I told you. I'm out." Slim's expression darkened. "You don't get to decide when you're out, Jay. You think you can just walk away from everything I built? From everything I did for you?" "I don't owe you nothing," Jay shot back. "I ain't killing nobody for you." Slim's face twisted with anger. He pulled a gun from his waistband and shoved it into Jay's hand. "You either do it, or you're the one who doesn't walk out of here tonight." Jay's mind raced, his grip on the gun trembling. He couldn't go through with it, he knew that much, but he also knew Slim wasn't bluffing. "All right," Jay said finally, his voice steadying. He raised the gun, aiming it at the young man, whose muffled cries grew louder. Then, in a flash, Jay spun and aimed the weapon at Slim's two men. "Drop it!" he barked. The men hesitated, their hands inching toward their own weapons. Jay fired a warning shot into the air, the sound echoing through the warehouse. "This ain't how it's gonna go, Slim," Jay said, his voice cold. "I'm leaving, and you ain't gonna stop me. You try anything, and I'll make sure you never run these streets again." Slim stared at him, his jaw clenched. "You think this is over? You think you can just pull a stunt like this and walk away?" Jay kept the gun trained on Slim's men as he backed toward the door. "I ain't scared of you, Slim. Not anymore." Jay didn't go home that night. Instead, he went straight to Isaiah's place, explaining everything that had happened. "This ain't over," Isaiah said grimly. "Slim's gonna come after you, and probably me too." Jay nodded, his expression hard. "I know, but I ain't running. If he wants a war, I'll give him one." The retaliation came fast. 2 nights later, Latrice's salon was vandalized, its windows smashed, and the words "snitch" spray-painted across the door. Jay knew it was a message. Pastor Daniels urged Jay to go to the police, but Jay shook his head. "The cops ain't gonna help us. They don't care about Crestview Heights. This is on me to fix." Isaiah stepped in, refusing to let Jay face Slim alone. They began quietly gathering allies, other residents tired of Slim's grip on the neighborhood. Maurice, now fully invested in turning his life around, used his connections to spread the word. "We ain't letting Slim run us no more," Maurice said during a meeting at the community center. "This is our neighborhood, and it's time we took it back." Another confrontation came on a rainy night in the middle of Crestview Heights. Jay and Isaiah stood with a small group of residents, facing off against Slim and his crew. "This is it, Slim," Jay said, his voice carrying over the rain. "You either back off, or we end this right here." Slim sneered. "You think these people are going to save you? You're nothing, Jay. Just a washed-up hustler trying to play hero." "I ain't a hero," Jay replied. "I'm just a man who's done being afraid of you." The standoff escalated quickly, but before it could turn violent, Kim Carter arrived with a camera crew, capturing the entire scene. Pastor Daniels had tipped her off, knowing the presence of media might deter Slim from escalating further. Under the glare of the cameras, Slim faltered. His crew began to back away, unwilling to risk their faces being plastered all over the news. "This ain't over," Slim growled, retreating into the shadows. The storm came on a quiet night. Slim, furious that Jay and Isaiah were rallying the community against him, decided it was time to send a message no one would forget. Jay and Isaiah were walking home from a late-night meeting at the community center when they saw the cars pull up. Doors slammed, and Slim and his men emerged, guns drawn. "This is what you wanted?" Slim shouted, his voice echoing through the empty street. "You want to turn my people against me?" Jay stepped forward, his hands raised. "It's over, Slim. The neighborhood don't want you here no more. You're done." Slim laughed, a cold, bitter sound. "You think you're some kind of savior, Jay? You think you can fix this place? Ain't nothing to fix. It's already broken." The air crackled with tension. Then, without warning, a shot rang out. Jay turned in horror as Isaiah stumbled backward, clutching his chest. Blood seeped through his shirt as he collapsed onto the pavement. "No!" Jay screamed, rushing to his friend's side. "Isaiah, stay with me." Isaiah's breaths were shallow, his eyes wide with pain. He tried to speak, but no words came. Slim and his crew fled as sirens wailed in the distance. Isaiah's death shattered the community. At his funeral, the church was packed with grieving neighbors, many of whom had been touched by his efforts to make a change. His mother, sitting in the front row, clutched her younger children tight. The silence after Isaiah's funeral was deafening. The sound of sobs and whispered condolences had faded, leaving behind an aching void that filled every corner of Crestview Heights. Miss Dixon sat in Isaiah's empty room that night, clutching a shirt of his, the faint scent of her son still lingering on it. Layla hovered by the door, unsure of how to comfort her mother. "Why didn't he just listen to you, Mama?" Layla asked, her voice trembling. Miss Dixon looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "Because sometimes people don't see a way out. He thought he was doing the right thing for us. But he left us," Layla said, her tiny voice breaking. "He left us all alone." Miss Dixon pulled her into her arms, her tears falling onto her hair. "I know, baby. I know." Layla clung to her memories of Isaiah, drawing pictures of him in her notebook and whispering to the stuffed animal he'd given her. One night, Miss Dixon found her crying in her bed. "Why'd he have to go, Mama?" Layla asked, her voice small and broken. Miss Dixon had no answers. All she could do was hold her daughter and pray for strength she no longer felt. Slim hadn't disappeared. Emboldened by the lack of police intervention, he tightened his grip on the streets. The community's efforts to rebuild were constantly undermined by fear and violence. One night, Jay sat in his car outside Slim's hangout, his fists clenched around the steering wheel. Latrice had begged him not to go, but he couldn't stay idle any longer. Inside, Slim laughed with his crew, his arrogance unchecked. Jay burst through the door, his rage boiling over. "This ends tonight," Jay growled. Slim smirked, leaning back in his chair. "You really think you can take me out, Jay? You're nothing. Always have been." Jay's hands shook as he pulled a gun from his waistband. "You killed my brother. You destroyed this neighborhood. I ain't letting you do it no more." Before Jay could act, one of Slim's men lunged at him. Chaos erupted. Shots rang out. Screams filled the air, and when the dust settled, Jay was bleeding on the floor. Slim stood over him, his face cold. "You don't run this, Jay. I do." Jay's death sent shockwaves through Crestview Heights. Latrice was left to pick up the pieces, her grief a heavy weight she carried silently. Her children struggled to understand why their father was gone, and Latrice had no answers for them. Kim Carter reported on the tragedy, her voice trembling as she spoke about the community's unending cycle of violence. Pastor Daniels gave a fiery sermon, urging the neighborhood to come together, but the hope in his voice felt thin. Months passed, but Crestview Heights remained haunted by the deaths of Isaiah and Jay. Slim's shadow still loomed, his power unchecked. One evening, Layla sat on the porch, staring up at the sky. "Do you think Isaiah and Mr. J are up there together, Mama?" "Miss." Dixon knelt beside her, pulling her close. "I hope so, baby. I hope so." In the distance, the sounds of the streets carried on, sirens, shouting, and the faint echo of laughter. Crestview Heights kept moving forward, but the scars of its losses ran deep, a constant reminder of the price so many had paid. The fight wasn't over, but for now, the weight of grief hung heavy in the air, an unshakable reminder of the fragility of hope in a world that refused to change.